There exists a truth so unsettling that most spend their entire lives avoiding it. A reality so raw that acknowledging it means abandoning the comfortable illusions we wrap around ourselves like armor against the world. What if the very nature of human interaction is not built on trust, goodwill, or mutual understanding, but on an endless dance of power, perception, and strategic maneuvering? What if every smile you receive, every promise spoken, every gesture of kindness carries within it a calculation, a hidden motive, a carefully crafted mask designed to achieve an end you cannot see? Niccolo Machiavelli understood this centuries ago, peering beneath the surface of courtly pleasantries and political pageantry to reveal the machinery of human nature in its most unvarnished form. He saw that people are not moved primarily by reason or virtue, but by fear, ambition, vanity, and self-interest, and that those who refuse to see this truth become nothing more than pawns in games played by those who do. The world is not divided between good people and bad people, but between those who understand the rules of human behavior and those who remain blissfully, dangerously ignorant of them. Every day, in every interaction, you are either reading the room or being read, either shaping perceptions or having your perceptions shaped, either directing the narrative or becoming a character in someone else's story. Machiavelli wrote that men judge more by the eyes than by the hands, meaning they are moved more by what appears to be true than by what actually is true. And this insight alone unlocks the entire mechanism of manipulation. When you fail to grasp this fundamental principle, you become vulnerable to every charlatan, every flatterer, every schemer who has learned to dress their intentions in the costume of your expectations. You believe what you want to believe, see what you hope to see, and in that gap between reality and perception, manipulation takes root and flourishes. Consider how often you have been persuaded against your better judgment, how many times you have agreed to something you later regretted, how frequently you have felt the sting of betrayal from someone you trusted completely. These are not random misfortunes or unfortunate coincidences. They are the predictable outcomes of entering a world of human interaction without understanding its true nature. Machiavelli observed that people are generally ungrateful, fickle, false, cowardly, and covetous, not because humanity is inherently evil, but because these traits serve survival and advancement in a competitive world. When you approach relationships expecting everyone to operate from the same code of honor you hold, you are like a soldier walking onto a battlefield believing everyone will play by gentlemen's rules, only to discover too late that others came prepared for war while you brought nothing but good intentions. The manipulation you experience daily is not always the work of evil masterminds plotting your downfall in shadowed rooms. More often, it is the subtle work of ordinary people employing tactics they may not even consciously recognize, tactics born from an intuitive understanding of human weakness. They know that flattery opens doors reason cannot unlock, that creating urgency bypasses careful deliberation, that appealing to your desire to be seen as generous or intelligent or moral makes you predictable and therefore controllable. Machiavelli warned that a prince must learn not to be good, not because goodness itself is wrong, but because those who are always good, among so many who are not good, will inevitably be destroyed. This is not cynicism, it is survival wisdom, the recognition that understanding human nature as it actually exists, rather than as we wish it to be, is the only defense against those who would exploit our noble illusions. What you are about to discover is not a descent into paranoia or misanthropy, but an ascent into clarity, a systematic unveiling of the patterns, principles, and psychological mechanisms that govern human behavior in its rawest form. Through Machiavelli's penetrating lens, you will learn to see beneath the masks people wear, to recognize the signs of manipulation before it takes hold, to distinguish genuine connection from strategic performance, and most importantly, to protect yourself without becoming the very thing you despise. This is not about becoming cold or calculating. It is about becoming conscious, about trading comfortable delusions for uncomfortable truths that will ultimately set you free from the invisible chains others try to place upon you. The journey begins not with changing others, but with fundamentally transforming how you see them, how you interpret their actions, and how you position yourself in the eternal game of human interaction. Understanding human nature begins with accepting a truth that most find deeply uncomfortable. People are far more predictable than they imagine themselves to be. Machiavelli observed this pattern across centuries of political intrigue and human behavior, noting that while circumstances change and technologies evolve, the fundamental drives that move human beings remain remarkably constant. People seek security, crave recognition, pursue pleasure, avoid pain, and above all, act in what they perceive to be their self-interest, even when that perception is clouded by emotion, ego, or incomplete information. This predictability is not a flaw in human design, but a feature of our survival mechanism. Hardwired responses that kept our ancestors alive long enough to pass their genes forward. The manipulator's entire arsenal rests on this foundation, on knowing that given the right stimulus, you will produce the expected response, as reliable as a chemical reaction. The first principle of protection is recognizing that your emotions are the primary gateway through which manipulation enters your decision-making process. Machiavelli understood that appealing to reason rarely moves people as effectively as triggering their passions, their fears, their vanities, their desires. When someone can make you afraid, you become willing to sacrifice freedom for security. When someone can make you angry, you become willing to act against your own interests just to strike back. When someone can make you feel special, chosen, understood in ways others fail to understand you, you become willing to ignore warning signs that would otherwise be obvious. These emotional triggers bypass the rational mind entirely, creating a direct pathway to your choices and behaviors. Every skilled manipulator knows this, which is why they spend their energy not on constructing logical arguments, but on engineering emotional states that make you suggestible, compliant, and willing to believe whatever story they are telling. Consider how often decisions that seem entirely rational in the moment reveal themselves later to have been driven by emotion you did not recognize at the time. You bought something you did not need because the seller created a sense of scarcity that triggered your fear of missing out. You trusted someone you should not have trusted because they mirrored your values and validated your worldview, making you feel seen and understood. You remained in a situation that harmed you because leaving would have required admitting you were wrong, and your pride could not bear that cost. Machiavelli observed that people are more moved by fear of loss than by hope of gain, a truth that modern psychology has confirmed through countless experiments. The manipulator leverages this asymmetry, framing their requests not as opportunities you might embrace, but as disasters you must prevent, knowing that your brain will prioritize avoiding the threat over carefully evaluating whether the threat is even real. The architecture of manipulation always includes a component of information control, determining what you see, what you know, and what remains hidden from your view. Machiavelli wrote extensively about the importance of controlling the narrative, recognizing that power flows to those who shape perception rather than those who merely respond to events. When someone can control the information you receive, they can control the reality you inhabit, because your understanding of any situation is built entirely from the data points available to you. If those data points are incomplete, slanted, or strategically curated, your conclusions will lead you exactly where the manipulator intended, and you will believe you arrived there through your own independent thinking. This is why manipulators isolate their targets from alternative perspectives, why they present carefully selected evidence while hiding contradictory facts, why they speak with absolute confidence about matters they only partially understand, knowing that certainty is often more persuasive than accuracy. Your vulnerability to manipulation increases dramatically when you are in states of emotional or cognitive depletion. Machiavelli recognized that timing matters enormously in human persuasion, that the same proposal rejected when someone is rested and clear-minded might be accepted when they are exhausted, stressed, or overwhelmed. Modern research confirms this intuition, showing that decision fatigue erodes our ability to evaluate choices critically, that stress makes us default to familiar patterns rather than considering new information, that emotional turmoil narrows our focus to immediate relief rather than long-term consequences. The skilled manipulator does not approach you when you are at your strongest. They wait for moments of weakness, creating those moments when necessary through deliberate escalation of pressure, confusion, or crisis. They know that a person who is tired, hungry, anxious, or processing multiple demands simultaneously will accept proposals they would normally reject, simply because resistance requires energy they no longer possess. The paradox of manipulation is that it often works best when the target believes they are too intelligent, too experienced, or too aware to be fooled. Machiavelli noted that pride blinds people more effectively than ignorance ever could, because the proud person approaches interactions with the assumption that they can see through deception, that their judgment is sound, that their instincts are reliable. This confidence becomes the very crack through which manipulation enters, because someone who believes they cannot be fooled stops watching for the signs of being fooled. They interpret their emotional responses as authentic reactions rather than engineered states. They trust their gut feelings without recognizing that those feelings have been carefully cultivated through strategic information and emotional priming. They believe they are making independent choices when they are actually selecting from a menu of options, all designed to benefit the manipulator. The illusion of choice masking the reality of constraint. The foundation of never being manipulated again is not becoming paranoid or cynical, but becoming conscious of these mechanisms within yourself. You must learn to recognize when your emotions are being deliberately triggered, when information is being selectively presented, when your state of depletion is being exploited, when your pride is being used against you. This requires a level of self-awareness that most people never develop, a willingness to observe your own reactions with the detachment of a scientist studying a specimen. Machiavelli's great insight was that knowledge of human nature must begin with knowledge of your own nature, with understanding that you are subject to the same drives, fears, and vulnerabilities as everyone else. Only by recognizing these patterns in yourself can you see them being activated by others, and only by seeing them can you choose whether to follow the script they have written for you or to write your own. Every person you encounter wears a mask, a carefully constructed presentation of self designed to achieve specific social outcomes, and Machiavelli understood that reading these masks correctly is essential to navigating human relationships without being deceived. The mask is not necessarily dishonest in the sense of being a complete fabrication, but it is always a selective revelation, emphasizing certain qualities while hiding others, projecting the image most likely to generate the desired response from the audience. People present themselves as more confident than they feel, more certain than they are, more virtuous than their actions demonstrate, more capable than their results suggest, because the social rewards flow to those who can project these qualities convincingly. The fundamental error most people make is assuming that the mask is the person, that the presentation is the reality, when in truth, the mask is simply a tool, a means to an end, discarded or modified the moment it no longer serves its purpose. The first type of mask you must learn to recognize is the mask of friendship, worn by those who approach you with warmth, interest, and apparent goodwill, but whose true motive is accessing something you possess. Whether that be resources, connections, information, or influence. Machiavelli observed that people rarely extend friendship without calculation, that even genuine affection often contains elements of self-interest, and that the wise person learns to distinguish between those who value your company and those who value what your company provides them. The mask of friendship is particularly dangerous because it exploits your desire to be liked, to be included, to be part of a community or alliance. When someone makes you feel welcomed, appreciated, and understood, your natural human response is to reciprocate, to lower your guard, to share more freely, to trust more readily. This is precisely what the manipulator wearing the mask of friendship counts on, your social instincts overriding your strategic judgment. The mask of authority presents another common form of deception, worn by those who position themselves as experts, leaders, or moral guides, deserving of deference and obedience. Machiavelli recognized that people have a deep-seated tendency to submit to authority, to assume that those in positions of power or expertise possess knowledge, virtue, or capability that justifies their position. This assumption creates a vulnerability that manipulators exploit by claiming credentials they do not have, citing expertise they do not possess, or leveraging titles and symbols of authority to bypass critical evaluation of their actual arguments. The mask of authority works because questioning authority feels risky, uncomfortable, even transgressive. And most people would rather defer to a confident charlatan than face the social discomfort of challenging someone who presents themselves as above challenge. The manipulator knows this and constructs their mask accordingly, speaking in absolutes, dismissing disagreement, and punishing dissent to reinforce the illusion that their authority is legitimate and unquestionable. Machiavelli devoted particular attention to the mask of virtue, worn by those who present themselves as operating from higher moral principles, selfless motives, or noble purposes, while their actions serve nothing but their own advancement. This is perhaps the most insidious mask of all, because it transforms self-interest into apparent selflessness, making it nearly impossible to oppose them without appearing to oppose the very values they claim to represent. If someone positions their request as serving justice, compassion, or the greater good, how can you refuse without seeming unjust, cruel, or selfish? The mask of virtue manipulates not just your judgment, but your identity, making compliance feel like a moral imperative rather than a strategic choice. Throughout history, the greatest atrocities have been committed by people wearing masks of virtue, convinced or pretending that their actions served some higher purpose. And the pattern continues today in every domain of human interaction where power can be acquired by claiming moral superiority. The mask of vulnerability operates through opposite mechanisms, presenting weakness, suffering, or helplessness to trigger your protective instincts, your desire to help, your reluctance to add to someone's burden. Machiavelli understood that displaying vulnerability can be as strategic as displaying strength, that people often gain power by appearing powerless, because the appearance of weakness disarms opposition and invites assistance. Someone who presents themselves as a victim automatically positions you as either their rescuer or their oppressor, a binary that makes refusal feel cruel and compliance feel compassionate. This mask is particularly effective because it exploits your best qualities, your empathy, your generosity, your sense of fairness, turning these virtues into vulnerabilities. The person wearing the mask of vulnerability may indeed be suffering, but they have learned to weaponize that suffering, to use it as currency in exchanges where they want something from you that straightforward asking would not obtain. Understanding these masks does not mean assuming everyone you meet is wearing one dishonestly, but rather recognizing that everyone presents a version of themselves designed to achieve social outcomes, and that discrepancy between presentation and reality varies enormously depending on the person and the context. Machiavelli's insight was not that everyone is a manipulator, but that everyone engages in some degree of strategic self-presentation, and that the wise person learns to distinguish between acceptable social performance and deliberate deception. You protect yourself not by assuming everyone is lying, but by observing whether their actions align with their words over time, whether the mask remains consistent or shifts depending on the audience, whether the image they project is supported by evidence or sustained only through assertion and performance. The ultimate protection against manipulation through masks is developing what Machiavelli called virtù, a quality that combines practical wisdom, strategic thinking, and the ability to see situations clearly without being clouded by wishful thinking or social conditioning. This means learning to trust patterns of behavior over professions of intent, to value demonstrated character over claimed identity, to recognize that what people do when they think no one is watching reveals more truth than what they say when everyone is listening. It means accepting that some people will wear masks their entire lives, that you cannot fix them or change them or make them be authentic, and that your only power lies in choosing how much access you give them to your resources, your trust, and your life. Machiavelli understood that in a world where everyone wears masks, the greatest power belongs not to those who wear the most convincing mask, but to those who can see through masks while maintaining their own strategic position. Manipulation functions through specific architectural patterns that, once recognized, lose much of their power over your decisions and behaviors. Machiavelli mapped these patterns extensively, observing how influence operates through predictable structures that recur across different contexts and relationships. The architecture of influence always begins with establishing what appears to be common ground, shared values, or mutual understanding, creating a foundation of agreement that makes subsequent requests seem like natural extensions of that shared perspective. When someone can get you nodding along, saying yes to small, obvious truths, they create psychological momentum that makes it harder for you to suddenly say no when the request escalates to something more significant. This technique, ancient as human persuasion itself, works because consistency feels good, contradiction feels uncomfortable, and once you have positioned yourself as someone who agrees with a particular framework, breaking from that framework requires admitting you were wrong, something ego resists powerfully. The second element in the architecture of influence involves controlling the frame through which a situation is interpreted, determining what counts as relevant information, what constitutes success or failure, what represents reasonable behavior or unreasonable demands. Machiavelli recognized that whoever sets the frame controls the outcome, because people make decisions based not on objective reality, but on their interpretation of reality, and interpretation depends entirely on frame. A skilled manipulator presents their request within a frame that makes acceptance seem obvious and refusal seem bizarre. They frame giving them what they want as helping yourself, frame questioning their motives as paranoia, frame setting boundaries as selfishness, frame protecting your interests as betraying shared values. Once the frame is established and accepted, the conclusion follows automatically, and you believe you arrived at that conclusion through your own reasoning, when in fact the conclusion was built into the frame from the beginning. Reciprocity forms the third critical component, the nearly universal human tendency to feel obligated to return favors, match gestures, or repay debts, even when those debts were created artificially by someone seeking leverage over you. Machiavelli observed that strategic gift-giving, Unsolicited favors and manufactured obligations are among the most effective tools of influence, because they create psychological debt that the recipient feels compelled to repay, often at a value far exceeding the original gesture. The manipulator offers something you did not ask for, then later requests something far more valuable, and you feel bound by reciprocity to comply because refusing feels ungrateful, petty, or socially inappropriate. This works even when you recognize the game being played, because the social pressure to reciprocate operates at a level deeper than conscious reasoning, wired into our species through millennia of survival in groups where failure to reciprocate meant social exclusion and potential death. The architecture includes what Machiavelli understood as the illusion of choice, presenting options that appear to offer freedom while actually constraining outcomes to serve the manipulator's interests. When someone asks whether you prefer option A or option B, they have already eliminated options C through Z from your consideration, but because you are choosing between alternatives, you feel autonomous and self-determining. This technique appears everywhere in human influence, from sales tactics that ask whether you want the blue one or the red one before you have decided whether you want one at all, to political frameworks that debate how to implement a policy before debating whether the policy should exist, to personal relationships where someone asks when you will do something rather than whether you will do it. The illusion of choice is particularly effective because it satisfies your need to feel autonomous while ensuring the outcome serves someone else's agenda. And unless you step back far enough to see the entire structure, you never realize the choice itself was the constraint. Time pressure operates as another load-bearing element in the architecture of influence, creating artificial urgency that prevents careful deliberation and triggers reactive rather than reflective decision-making. Machiavelli recognized that people make very different decisions under time pressure than they do with adequate opportunity for reflection, that urgency bypasses analysis and activates survival instincts oriented toward immediate action rather than strategic consideration. The manipulator manufactures deadlines, emphasizes limited availability, warns of dire consequences from delay, or simply exhausts you through prolonged pressure until you agree just to end the discomfort. This works because the human brain is designed to prioritize immediate threats over long-term consequences, to act first and think later when survival seems at stake. And what constitutes a threat is determined by perception rather than reality. If someone can make you feel that refusing them represents a threat, your brain will push you toward compliance regardless of what your reasoning suggests. Social proof provides the sixth element, leveraging your tendency to look to others for guidance on how to think, feel, or behave, especially in situations of uncertainty or ambiguity. Machiavelli observed that people rarely form opinions independently, instead adopting the views of those around them, particularly those they admire, fear, or wish to emulate. The manipulator exploits this by creating the impression that everyone else has already agreed, that you are the only holdout, that refusing makes you the outlier rather than the person setting boundaries. They cite testimonials, reference unnamed experts, invoke popular consensus, or simply assert that what they are asking is normal, expected, obvious to anyone reasonable. This technique is devastatingly effective because humans are social creatures whose survival historically depended on remaining aligned with group consensus, and the fear of social exclusion triggers anxiety that overwhelms rational evaluation of whether the supposed consensus actually exists or represents wisdom. Understanding this architecture does not make you immune to its effects, but it does give you the critical distance necessary to recognize when you are being moved through a deliberate structure rather than making authentic choices based on your actual values and interests. Machiavelli's wisdom lies in recognizing that these patterns exist, that they are neither good nor evil, but simply tools that can be used ethically or manipulatively depending on intent, and that your protection comes not from naively trusting everyone or cynically trusting no one, but from developing the discernment to see the structure before you are too far inside it to escape. When you can recognize common ground being manufactured, frames being imposed, reciprocity being engineered, choices being constrained, urgency being artificially created, and social proof being fabricated, you retain the power to step back, question the entire architecture, and make decisions based on what actually serves your interests, rather than what someone wants you to believe serves your interests. Words are the primary instruments of manipulation, and Machiavelli understood that mastering the language of deception requires recognizing how meaning can be obscured, distorted, or inverted through strategic use of rhetoric, misdirection, and linguistic sleight of hand. The manipulator's vocabulary is carefully constructed to create impressions without making verifiable claims, to suggest connections without explicitly stating them, to imply promises without creating actual obligations. When you learn to listen for what is being carefully not said, for the gaps between assertion and evidence, for the difference between sounding authoritative and actually being informed, you begin to see through the linguistic fog that keeps most people confused, compliant, and convinced they are making informed decisions when they are actually responding to manufactured impressions. The first pattern to recognize is the use of vague language that sounds specific, words that create the feeling of precision without actually committing to anything measurable or verifiable. Machiavelli observed that political language excels at this art, promising better futures without defining what better means, pledging support without specifying what form that support will take, expressing concern without committing to action, claiming expertise without demonstrating knowledge. When someone tells you they will take care of something, what exactly are they promising? When they say they have significant experience, what constitutes significant? When they claim most people agree, who are these people and what exactly did they agree to? The vague language works because your brain automatically fills in the gaps with optimistic assumptions, interpreting ambiguity in the most favorable light. And only later, when the promised results fail to materialize, do you realize that nothing specific was ever actually promised. Manipulative language often employs what can be called the truth sandwich, where a significant lie or misdirection is placed between two true statements, allowing the falsehood to borrow credibility from the surrounding facts. Machiavelli recognized this pattern in political rhetoric, where speakers establish credibility through verifiable claims, then slip in the assertion they actually want you to believe, then conclude with another verifiable fact, and the psychological momentum carries you past the central deception without triggering critical examination. Someone might say the economy is struggling, which you can verify, then claim their solution is the only viable option, which is the manipulative assertion. Then note that something must be done, which you also believe, and suddenly you find yourself supporting their specific solution without ever evaluating whether it actually addresses the problem or whether alternatives exist that they deliberately failed to mention. The language of false equivalence creates another powerful tool of deception, presenting vastly different things as if they were comparable, or treating fundamentally unequal situations as if they deserved equal consideration. Machiavelli watched political operators master this technique, comparing minor inconveniences to major injustices, equating expert analysis with uninformed opinion, treating good faith disagreement as equivalent to bad faith manipulation, and thereby confusing issues so thoroughly that clear thinking becomes nearly impossible. When someone argues that both sides are equally guilty, that all politicians are the same, that every option has equal merit or equal fault, They are not describing reality, but attempting to paralyze your judgment, to make every choice seem arbitrary, to convince you that careful discernment is pointless because everything is equally flawed. This linguistic move is particularly insidious because it sounds balanced, fair, even wise, when it is actually a method of obscuring genuine differences that matter enormously. Another deceptive pattern involves the strategic use of emotional language designed to trigger reactive thinking rather than reflective analysis. Words chosen not for accuracy, but for their ability to activate fear, outrage, tribal loyalty, or moral certainty. Machiavelli recognized that when someone can make you sufficiently angry, afraid, or morally righteous, your capacity for nuanced thinking collapses, and you become vulnerable to accepting conclusions you would normally question. The manipulator describes situations in crisis language, uses catastrophic framing for ordinary problems, employs moral absolutes where gray areas exist, and invokes existential threats to justify extreme responses. By the time you calm down enough to think clearly, you have already committed to positions, made promises, or taken actions that serve the manipulator's agenda, and reversing course now requires admitting you were swept up in emotion rather than guided by reason, an admission that ego makes nearly impossible. The technique of redefinition allows manipulators to use familiar words while secretly changing their meanings, creating conversations where you think you are discussing one thing while they are actually arguing for something else entirely. Machiavelli observed this linguistic sleight of hand in political and philosophical discourse, where terms like freedom, justice, equality, security, or success get redefined to serve specific agendas, and before you realize the shift has occurred, you find yourself supporting conclusions that contradict your actual values because you were operating with different definitions than the person persuading you. When someone redefines violence to include speech, or redefines speech to include silence, or redefines rights to include entitlements, or redefines fairness to mean equal outcomes rather than equal opportunities, they are not clarifying concepts, but manipulating them, using the emotional weight of the original term to smuggle in meanings that would be rejected if stated plainly. Machiavelli's insight extended to recognizing how manipulative language often includes what might be called the noble lie. Falsehoods presented not as deceptions, but as necessary fictions that serve some greater good, with the manipulator positioning themselves as wise enough to know when truth should be sacrificed for utility. This is perhaps the most dangerous linguistic pattern of all, because it provides moral cover for any deception, justifying lies by claiming they prevent greater harm, protect the vulnerable, maintain social order, or achieve outcomes that truth-telling would prevent. Once you accept the premise that some lies are noble, you have no defense against being lied to by anyone who claims their particular deception serves noble purposes, and you will never know whether you are being manipulated for genuine benefit or simply being told whatever story makes you compliant. Protection against linguistic manipulation requires developing what might be called defensive listening, an active practice of questioning not just what is being said, but how it is being said, why these particular words were chosen, what is being assumed without argument, what is being implied without evidence, and what alternative interpretations exist that are being deliberately excluded from consideration. When someone speaks with great confidence, ask yourself what evidence supports that confidence. When language becomes vague, ask for specifics. When emotions are being triggered, step back and examine the argument stripped of its emotional loading. When definitions seem to shift, pause and establish clear terms. When false equivalencies are drawn, demand that genuine differences be acknowledged. Machiavelli understood that language is a battlefield where those who control definitions, frame debates, and shape emotional landscapes win without the other side, even realizing a war was being fought. And your only defense is developing the discipline to think clearly, even when language is designed to make clear thinking impossible. Understanding human nature ultimately means understanding power, how it is acquired, maintained, concealed, and exercised, because Machiavelli recognized that beneath all the masks, language, and architectural patterns of influence lies the fundamental reality of power relationships. Every human interaction contains some dimension of power, some question of who influences whom, who sets the terms, who yields, who prevails, and the person who fails to recognize these dynamics becomes a piece moved by others rather than a player moving themselves. Power is not inherently evil, despite what comfortable moralities claim. It is simply the capacity to affect outcomes, to make things happen or prevent things from happening, to shape the environment rather than being passively shaped by it. The manipulation you experience in life comes primarily from people who understand power dynamics better than you do, who know how to leverage their position while keeping you unaware that leverage is being applied. The first principle of power dynamics is that power flows to those who appear to possess it, creating a self-reinforcing cycle where the perception of power generates actual power, regardless of whether that perception reflects underlying reality. Machiavelli observed this pattern throughout political history, noting that leaders who project confidence, certainty, and command attract followers, resources, and opportunities, while those who appear weak or uncertain, even if substantively more capable, struggle to gain traction. The manipulator exploits this dynamic by performing power they do not actually possess, speaking with authority they have not earned, making promises they cannot keep, and counting on your assumption that someone who acts powerful must be powerful. By the time you realize the performance was hollow, they have already extracted what they wanted from you, and your validation of their performance has made them slightly more powerful in reality than they were when the performance began. Power in relationships is determined largely by who needs whom more, and Machiavelli understood that the fundamental vulnerability in any exchange comes from visible need or desire. When someone knows you need something they can provide, whether that is approval, resources, information access, or emotional validation, they gain leverage over you proportional to the intensity of your need and the scarcity of alternatives. The skilled manipulator cultivates your dependency, making themselves seem like the only source of what you want, the only person who truly understands you, the only option that makes sense in your situation, thereby eliminating your alternatives until you feel you have no choice but to accept their terms. They might create this dependency gradually, slowly becoming indispensable, or suddenly through crisis that makes you desperate for immediate solutions. But the mechanism remains the same. Need creates vulnerability, and vulnerability creates leverage. The paradox Machiavelli identified is that those who most desperately seek power are often those least suited to wield it wisely, because the desperation itself indicates insecurity, lack of substance, or absence of genuine capability that would generate natural authority. People secure in their competence and value do not need to constantly assert dominance, manufacture crises to demonstrate their problem-solving, or diminish others to elevate themselves. The manipulator's hunger for control often manifests in these behaviors, in chronic need to be the smartest person in the room, to have the final word, to ensure everyone knows their position in the hierarchy, to punish any challenge to their authority, however slight. When you encounter someone who cannot tolerate disagreement, who interprets questions as threats, who demands loyalty but offers none in return, who takes credit for successes but blames others for failures, You are encountering someone whose relationship with power is fundamentally insecure and therefore fundamentally dangerous. Machiavelli recognized that true power often operates invisibly, through shaping contexts rather than making demands, through creating situations where people choose what you want them to choose, while believing the choice was entirely their own. This is the highest form of influence, where no force is visible, no pressure is applied, no resistance is triggered, because the manipulation occurs at the level of framing reality itself. Someone with this kind of power does not tell you what to do. They arrange circumstances so that what they want you to do appears to be the only sensible option. They do not argue you into agreement. They create environments where their perspective seems obviously correct. They do not force compliance. They engineer situations where compliance feels like autonomous choice. This level of manipulation is nearly impossible to defend against directly, because you cannot resist pressure you do not perceive, cannot question frames you do not recognize as frames. The dynamics of power also include understanding that people rarely relinquish power voluntarily, that asking those who benefit from existing arrangements to surrender their advantages appeals to virtues they almost certainly do not possess. Machiavelli was brutally clear about this, noting that those who have power will use whatever means necessary to keep it, that appeals to fairness or justice mean nothing to people whose position depends on unfairness and injustice, that expecting powerful manipulators to reform themselves because it is the right thing to do is naive beyond description. Change in power dynamics comes not from moral persuasion, but from shifting the underlying conditions that make certain power relationships possible, from creating alternatives that reduce dependency, from organizing collective resistance that makes the costs of manipulation exceed the benefits, from developing your own power resources that allow you to negotiate from position rather than from need. The ultimate insight about power dynamics is that powerlessness is often a choice, unconscious but still a choice, rooted in failure to recognize and exercise the power you actually possess. Machiavelli understood that even in highly constrained situations, some agency exists, some capacity to refuse, resist, or reframe remains available if you are willing to pay the costs. You have the power to say no, to walk away, to endure consequences rather than accept unacceptable terms, to build alternatives rather than remain trapped in impossible situations. But exercising this power requires clarity about your values, courage to face uncertainty, and willingness to accept that protecting yourself sometimes means disappointing others, breaking relationships, or acknowledging that situations you hoped would improve will not improve. The manipulator counts on you choosing the comfort of familiar suffering over the risk of unknown freedom. And they are usually right, because most people would rather complain about their powerlessness than embrace the power they have, but fear to use. Protecting yourself from manipulation ultimately depends on developing discernment, the capacity to distinguish between genuine and counterfeit, between substance and performance, between what serves your interests and what merely appears to serve them while actually serving someone else. Machiavelli understood that discernment is not an innate quality, but a cultivated skill, developed through experience, reflection, and willingness to see reality as it is rather than as you wish it to be. Most people never develop true discernment because it requires abandoning comforting stories, acknowledging painful truths, and accepting that some people you love or admire are not who you believe them to be. The price of discernment is disillusionment, but the reward is freedom from manipulation by those who depend on your illusions to maintain their influence over you. The first element of discernment is learning to distinguish between confidence and competence, between people who sound authoritative and people who actually know what they are talking about. Machiavelli observed that the least qualified people often speak with the greatest certainty because genuine expertise brings awareness of complexity, limitations, and alternative perspectives, while ignorance allows for absolute conviction untroubled by doubt. When someone presents every issue as simple, every solution as obvious, every question as settled, they are signaling not wisdom, but lack of understanding. Yet this very certainty attracts followers who want to believe that complex problems have simple solutions. Discernment requires asking for evidence, questioning assumptions, testing claims against reality, and accepting that someone who admits uncertainty might understand the situation better than someone who admits none. Discernment also means recognizing the difference between people who help you grow and people who keep you dependent, between those who enhance your capacity and those who monopolize it. Machiavelli noted that wise counselors increase the prince's power, while manipulative counselors make themselves indispensable, and this pattern appears across all relationships. Someone genuinely invested in your well-being teaches you skills, shares knowledge, creates opportunities for you to succeed independently, and celebrates when you outgrow your need for them. Someone invested in controlling you withholds information, creates dependency, undermines your confidence in your own judgment, and ensures you remain convinced that you cannot function without their guidance. The test is simple. After interacting with this person, do you feel more capable or less capable, more clear or more confused, more confident or more uncertain about yourself? If the pattern consistently moves toward the latter, you are being diminished rather than developed, regardless of what the person claims their intentions are. Another critical aspect of discernment involves distinguishing between people responding to you as an individual and people responding to you as a role, a resource, or a representation of something they want or fear. Machiavelli understood that people rarely see each other clearly, instead projecting their needs, desires, fears, and fantasies onto others, then responding to the projection rather than the person. When someone's treatment of you changes dramatically based on your circumstances, when their warmth depends on your utility, when their respect correlates with your status or resources, they are not actually relating to you, but to what you represent. True discernment means recognizing these transactional relationships for what they are, neither condemning them as inherently wrong nor mistaking them for genuine connection, but simply understanding that this person's interest in you is conditional and will evaporate the moment conditions change. Machiavelli taught that discernment requires paying more attention to patterns than to exceptions, to consistent behavior over time, rather than to moments of apparent transformation or isolated acts of generosity. People reveal their true nature through repeated behavior under varying conditions, not through their best moments or their promises about who they want to become. The manipulator knows this and works to keep you focused on exceptions, on the occasional kindness that supposedly outweighs consistent cruelty, on the promised future that never quite arrives but always seems just one more chance away, on the explanation for why this time was different and the pattern will not repeat. Discernment means trusting patterns over explanations, recognizing that who someone is can be read far more reliably from what they repeatedly do than from what they occasionally say or situationally perform when they need something from you. Developing discernment also means becoming comfortable with ambiguity and incompleteness, accepting that you will never have perfect information, that some questions cannot be answered definitively. That uncertainty is the permanent condition of human knowledge. Machiavelli recognized that manipulators exploit the human discomfort with uncertainty, offering false certainty to people desperate to feel that they understand and control their situations. They present themselves as having all the answers, knowing exactly what will happen, seeing clearly what remains murky to everyone else. And this claim to certainty feels so reassuring that people accept it even when evidence contradicts it. True discernment requires the intellectual honesty to admit what you do not know, to live with doubt when doubt is warranted, to resist the temptation to embrace comforting lies over uncomfortable uncertainties, and to make the best decisions you can with incomplete information while remaining ready to adjust when new information emerges. The cultivation of discernment ultimately requires what Machiavelli called virtù, that combination of practical wisdom, strategic thinking, moral clarity, and personal courage that allows someone to see the world clearly and act effectively within it, despite its difficulties and dangers. This is not something you achieve once and possess forever, but something you must practice continuously. Questioning your own assumptions, examining your own biases, checking your interpretations against evidence, and maintaining the intellectual humility to recognize when you have been wrong. Every manipulation you fail to detect becomes a lesson if you are willing to learn from it, rather than simply feeling victimized by it. Every relationship that reveals itself as transactional teaches you to recognize transactional patterns earlier. Every smooth-talking charlatan who deceives you makes you slightly more resistant to the next one, provided you are willing to study how the deception worked, rather than simply vowing to be more trusting or more cynical going forward. The ultimate defense against manipulation is sovereignty, the cultivation of self-possession so complete that your sense of self, your values, your decisions, and your life direction come from internal sources rather than external validation. Machiavelli understood that people can only be manipulated to the degree they need something from the manipulator, whether that need is material resources, social approval, emotional validation, or the illusion of certainty in an uncertain world. When you develop genuine sovereignty, when your worth derives from your own standards rather than others' opinions, when your decisions reflect your authentic values rather than your desire to avoid disapproval, when you can tolerate uncertainty, discomfort, and social pressure without abandoning your judgment, you become nearly impossible to manipulate because the manipulator has nothing to leverage. They can no longer use your fear of rejection, your hunger for approval, your need to be liked, your desire to avoid conflict, or your hope that others will finally give you what you cannot give yourself. Building sovereignty begins with radical honesty about who you are, what you actually value, what you genuinely want rather than what you have been conditioned to want, and what you are willing to sacrifice to maintain your integrity. Machiavelli recognized that most people never engage in this deep self-examination, instead adopting the values, beliefs, and aspirations of their culture, family, peer group, or whatever ideology promises to make sense of their existence. This borrowed identity makes them infinitely manipulable, because anyone who can speak to those adopted values, who can claim to represent those beliefs, who can promise to fulfill those conditioned aspirations, gains automatic influence over them. Sovereignty requires stripping away these layers of conditioning, however painful that process might be, and discovering what remains when you stop performing for others. Stop trying to be who you think you should be, and start acknowledging who you actually are, beneath all the masks you have learned to wear. Sovereignty also means accepting full responsibility for your choices and their consequences, refusing to remain a victim of circumstances, other people's actions, or your own past decisions. Machiavelli was merciless about this, arguing that people remain powerless primarily because powerlessness relieves them of responsibility, allows them to blame others for their suffering, and provides endless excuses for why they cannot change their situations. The sovereign individual recognizes that even in highly constrained circumstances, some degree of choice exists. Some capacity to respond, rather than simply react, remains available, and that the quality of your life depends far more on how you respond to what happens than on what happens. This does not mean pretending you have power you do not possess, but it does mean refusing to surrender the power you do possess by claiming helplessness when options, however difficult or costly, actually exist. The practice of sovereignty includes developing the capacity to be alone without being lonely, to derive satisfaction from your own company, thoughts, and pursuits, rather than requiring constant external stimulation, validation, or entertainment. Machiavelli observed that people who cannot tolerate solitude are easy prey for manipulators because their desperate need for company, attention, or distraction makes them willing to accept bad relationships, toxic environments, and harmful influences rather than face themselves. When you develop comfort with solitude, when you can sit with your thoughts without needing to escape them, when you find fulfillment in activities that require no audience, you eliminate one of the primary leverage points manipulators use. You no longer need them to rescue you from yourself, to give your life meaning, to provide purpose or direction, because you have developed these internally rather than seeking them externally. Machiavelli understood that sovereignty requires financial independence, or at least financial resilience, because economic dependency creates vulnerability that manipulators ruthlessly exploit. When someone controls your access to resources necessary for survival or comfort, they control you, regardless of what other freedoms you imagine you possess. This does not mean you must be wealthy, but it does mean developing the capacity to support yourself, maintaining reserves that allow you to walk away from situations that require surrendering your autonomy, and building skills that create options rather than leaving you trapped in arrangements you cannot afford to leave. The sovereign individual views economic decisions through the lens of freedom rather than purely through the lens of consumption, asking not just what you can afford to buy, but what you can afford to refuse, what you can afford to walk away from, what you can afford to lose, rather than compromise yourself. The practice of sovereignty includes developing what might be called strategic detachment, the ability to care deeply about outcomes without becoming so attached to them that you lose perspective, make desperate decisions, or become vulnerable to manipulation by anyone who promises to help you achieve what you desperately want. Machiavelli recognized that desire makes people exploitable, that the intensity of your wanting creates the magnitude of your vulnerability, and that those who can control their attachments while remaining engaged with life maintain advantages over those who cannot. This is not about becoming cold or indifferent, but about maintaining enough distance from your desires that you can evaluate opportunities clearly, recognize manipulation when it appears, and walk away from bad deals even when they offer something you deeply want, because you understand that the price being asked exceeds the value being offered. Sovereignty culminates in what Machiavelli described as the capacity to be both loved and feared, both cooperative and formidable, both generous and fiercely protective of your boundaries. The sovereign individual is not a hermit withdrawn from human connection, but someone who engages with others from a position of strength rather than need, who contributes to relationships without losing themselves in them, who can be warm without being weak, kind without being naive, trusting without being gullible. They give freely when giving makes sense, refuse firmly when refusal is necessary, forgive when forgiveness serves their values, and hold grudges when forgetting would mean enabling repeated harm. They are not perfectly consistent because consistency itself can become a vulnerability that manipulators exploit through predictability, but they are fundamentally coherent, aligned with their values, and unwilling to betray themselves for the sake of being liked, accepted, or included in communities that require self-abandonment as the price of membership. The journey through Machiavelli's insights into human nature returns us to where we began, but with eyes now open to realities that most spend their lives avoiding, preferring comfortable illusions to uncomfortable truths. You have learned that people are moved not by reason, but by emotion, not by logic, but by interest, not by what is true, but by what appears to be true, and that this fundamental architecture of human behavior remains constant beneath all the surface variations of culture, technology, and circumstance. This knowledge does not make the world darker. It makes you clearer, better equipped to navigate the complexities of human interaction without losing yourself in others' agendas, better able to distinguish genuine connection from strategic performance, and better prepared to protect what matters to you without becoming the very thing you seek to defend against. The wisdom lies not in cynicism that assumes everyone is manipulative, nor in naivety that assumes no one is, but in discernment that can tell the difference and respond accordingly. Understanding human nature as Machiavelli revealed it means accepting that power dynamics are inescapable, that influence flows through every interaction, and that the question is never whether these forces exist, but whether you will be conscious of them or unconscious, whether you will be shaped by them or shape them, whether you will be moved like a piece on someone else's board or become a player making your own moves. The masks people wear, the language they use, the architectures of influence they construct, the power they seek and wield, these are neither good nor evil in themselves, but simply the medium through which human beings pursue their interests and express their natures. Your sovereignty depends not on eliminating these dynamics, which is impossible, but on seeing them clearly enough to navigate them without being controlled by them, on developing the strength to maintain your values while operating in a world where not everyone shares them, and on building a life where your choices reflect your authentic self rather than the accumulated manipulations of everyone who wanted something from you. The practice of sovereignty that protects you from manipulation is ultimately the practice of knowing yourself so thoroughly that external voices cannot drown out your internal compass, of valuing your integrity more than you value approval, of accepting the costs of freedom rather than paying the price of comfortable captivity. Machiavelli showed us that this path is not easy, that it requires constant vigilance, uncomfortable honesty, and the courage to stand alone when standing with the crowd would mean compromising what you know to be right. But he also showed that this is the only path to genuine power, the only route to authentic relationships, and the only way to live a life that belongs to you, rather than to the endless succession of people who would claim pieces of it if you let them. The world will always contain manipulators, but it need not contain you among their victims. Not anymore. Not now that you understand the game being played and have chosen to play it consciously rather than being played unconsciously. As you move forward from this moment, you carry with you not just information but transformation, not just knowledge but power. The power that comes from seeing clearly in a world that profits from your confusion, from standing firmly in a world that prefers you uncertain, from choosing consciously in a world designed to make you react unconsciously. Every interaction you have from this point forward becomes an opportunity to practice what you have learned, to test your discernment, to refine your sovereignty, to become increasingly skilled at recognizing manipulation before it takes hold and protecting yourself without becoming paranoid or closed off from genuine connection. The work is never finished, because human nature never changes and new forms of manipulation are constantly emerging. But you now possess the framework for understanding them all, the foundation upon which you can build a life of authentic freedom, regardless of what games others choose to play around you. Let this understanding settle into you not as a burden of eternal suspicion, but as a gift of liberating clarity. The knowledge that allows you to engage with the world as it actually is, rather than as you wish it to be, to form relationships based on reality rather than projection, to make choices that serve your true interests rather than someone else's disguised agenda. If this content has shifted something fundamental in how you see human interaction, if it has given you tools you recognize you needed but did not know existed, if it has illuminated patterns you have lived with unconsciously and can now navigate consciously, then demonstrate that recognition by engaging with this community of people committed to clear seeing and authentic living. Like this video, if it resonated with your experience, share it with someone who needs to understand these dynamics. Comment with your own observations about the masks and manipulations you have encountered, and subscribe to continue developing the discernment and sovereignty that make manipulation impossible. This is not just content to consume, but wisdom to practice, not just ideas to consider, but principles to embody. And your journey toward complete freedom from manipulation begins the moment you choose consciousness over conditioning, clarity over comfort, and sovereignty over the seductive safety of remaining small enough to be controlled.